Yeah, we've got some competition. So why don't people move forward? Look, we're small but mighty today at the GEF Pavilion. Look, thank you for joining. My name's Richard Florizone. I'm CEO of the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Welcome here to those of you here in Montreal and those who are joining us online for a discussion about something we're very passionate about, which is nature-based infrastructure and their role in helping cities achieve sustainability. We've got a fabulous panel today to have some discussions. We're joined by Ben Simmons, who's our Director of Infrastructure here on my left from IISD, who'll give an opening presentation in a second. And then some old and new friends with Joanna Icahn from the Intact Center. Welcome. It's so nice to have you here, Joanna. And then we've got Christine Mwangi, who's joining us from WWF in Africa, and so wonderful to have your view. And then Ivo Mulder from the Climate Finance Unit in the UN Environmental Program. So we've got a great panel for you. Look, just to set the stage very briefly, cities are really on the front lines of the climate crisis, right? Especially its impact on people. So cities are growing, obviously. We know that cities will be home to an additional 2.5 billion people by 2050. And by 2070, over half, 58% of the world's population will live in cities. So that's where the people are. You also know, if you've worked with mayors or with city councilors, you know that infrastructure is top of mind for them, right? I mean, dealing daily with not just the climate impacts on infrastructure, but how you renew infrastructure, maintain it. They're top issues for cities. And of course, that's becoming more and more important as cities and their infrastructure suffer the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation, right? So it's front of mind for them. And it's always going to be an increasing concern, that connection between climate and their infrastructure, given that cities are responsible for 70% of greenhouse gas emissions, and an estimated 850 different vertebrate species are threatened due to habitat loss from cities. So when you think about nature-based solutions, right, investing with nature, alongside nature, or nature-based infrastructure, what an incredibly important topic for cities. Because as they grapple with climate and biodiversity challenges, but also with their infrastructure challenges, as you'll hear, nature-based infrastructure, NBI, offers a great way not just to address the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis, but do it often in an economically attractive way that yields other benefits. So that's the preamble. That's why we're here. Now, before we go to Ben and get into a conversation with our great panelists, I'd like to just put you all on the spot and just ask, and Ivo, this was Ivo's great idea, so I'm going to give him credit. He thought we should ask you, what interests you particularly about this topic? What is it you'd like us to address? Because that can help us frame the conversation for the next 55 or so minutes. So nature-based infrastructure and sustainable cities. Anyone want to start with what their thoughts are or what they're really hoping to get out of this session? Here we go.
I came here because I would like to learn more about kind of the spectrum from nature to gray. How do you move along the spectrum of that?
Excellent. So yeah, there is a whole spectrum, right? If you go from nature all the way to pouring concrete, there is a blend. Yeah, please.
I'm going to sort of cheat and echo what he just said in terms of the spectrum, but I work for WaterAid, so we're looking at SDG 6 and how do we apply nature-based solutions in water and sanitation. And there's been a number of mentions of wastewater management in cities. There was a session the other day on nature for cities, and I'd just be curious about where we land with water and nature-based solutions in urban settings.
I'm so glad you're here because from my point of view, when you look at nature-based solutions or nature-based infrastructure for climate resilience, the most vivid examples have to do with water, I think, and managing floodwaters. We'll take one more.
Yes, I'm interested in some of the planning tools that cities have.
Excellent.
Yeah, for long-term planning, and also take into consideration like the data and ecosystem services that can be integrated in the decision making.
Wonderful. Yeah, planning. And that's great because the valuation and the tools is a lot of what we're trying to do with the NBI Center with the GEF. But I think, Ivo, we're also going to get into this conversations with you around, what are those barriers that we need? How can we overcome some of them? Anyone else? Anything else you want to offer? Well, that gives us some great framing conversation. So look, I am going to turn it over to Ben Simmons, who's going to give a brief overview of a paper that we've done exploring the potential benefits of implementing nature-based infrastructure in cities. So, Ben, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks. Veronica, did you want to add another topic?
Hi, yeah, thank you. I'd just like to know where the biodiversity co-benefits can come in and when they can be considered and how to make sure that any nature-based infrastructure does result in that net gain. Thank you. Yes, so net gain in biodiversity or in ecosystem integrity. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And I would encourage those of you that are in the back, if you want to come in, we still have some seats here as well, up in the front as well. You're all very, very welcome. We have to be a little bit tight because there's other events that are going on, so it's good to have you come forward. Thanks, everyone. Just to mention that, and thanks, Richard, just to mention that we've also launched a paper today in conjunction with COP15 and in conjunction with this event, really focusing in on nature-based infrastructure and urban areas. And the impetus of this was, as Richard mentioned, at the last COP, so I guess it was COP26 in Glasgow, we jointly launched a new nature-based infrastructure global resource center. And this was launched and led by IISD in partnership with the support from GEF, the MAVA Foundation, and the UN Industrial Development Organization. So those are the key partners to this initiative. And the focus is really to respond to some of the questions that have already been asked, which is how do we think about scaling nature-based infrastructure? How do we think about supporting some of the principal project proponents for nature-based infrastructure through deepening our valuations around that and financial modeling? Because traditionally in the valuations, as most of us know, they focus almost exclusively on economic issues. And so what we've been trying to promote through the nature-based infrastructure is a much broader view of these cost-benefit analyses and assessments to look also at the social and environmental costs and benefits. And so that's been a focus of ours really over the last 2 years, a year in preparation for getting the nature-based infrastructure up and running, but also over the course of the last year. In terms of the paper that we launched today, I just wanted to mention we identified basically 8 of the projects that we've been focused on over the course of the last few years, and these you can see that with these projects, they really cover a range of different types of nature-based infrastructure, everything from tree planting to stormwater management and wastewater management. So what the study does is it describes these case studies. But also begins to look at what some of the valuations were. What were some of the results from those efforts? And for each of those projects and the projects that we support through the center, it involves quite a detailed economic analysis through a cost-benefit analysis. And it looks at all types of ecosystem services, values those ecosystem services, and incorporates them in the cost-benefit analysis. And then it compares those, and this I think maybe speaks to the question about how do we transition or how do we link some of the nature-based infrastructure to the gray infrastructure. It compares those nature-based infrastructure potential investments to gray infrastructure, but it also compares the costs and benefits of just building gray infrastructure, but also combining a nature-based infrastructure component with that. And what we've seen is many of the project proponents that we're working with are really interested in both of those, right? How do we combine those two things? I wanted just to provide this example because it gives a sense of the type of considerations we look at when we develop these cost-benefit analyses. And so you can see it's not just the traditional economic costs. We're also looking at some of the avoided costs and some of the added benefits as well. And for us, and for a lot of the project proponents that we're working with, the key number is that benefit to cost ratio. You know, how much for every dollar invested, how much benefit will I receive in the end? And what we're finding in our studies is that when you're just comparing nature-based infrastructure to gray infrastructure, often that cost benefit or that benefit to cost ratio, if you will, it often favors the gray infrastructure rather than the nature-based infrastructure. It's only when you look at some of the avoided costs and the resilience and the other benefits, the social benefits as well, that you begin to see it balance out. And in many cases, what we're finding is the nature-based infrastructure solutions are much more cost-effective. So I just wanted to end with this one slide on some of the key messages from the study. And really, for purposes of today's discussion, maybe focus on just these two, because I think they're the most relevant. And that is that what we're finding with our studies with various project proponents in cities is that the nature-based infrastructure tends to be much cheaper, so 40% cheaper than just gray infrastructure alone, and offer 36% more value than just building with gray infrastructure alone when you take into account these avoided costs and co-benefits. And then secondly, the other interesting outcome for us has been this analysis of how do we think about nature's role in supporting existing gray infrastructure and new gray infrastructure. And what we're finding is there's really a dearth of evidence and analysis on that issue right now. And that's something that we hope to pursue, is really begin to value what that means. How can nature be incorporated into existing infrastructure and make that available also to the project proponents? So now, Richard, over to you.
Well, thanks, Ben. Look, I just want to make one summary comment on that, and that is to say, what is the big issue that ties together, COP27 weeks ago in Sharm el-Sheikh and what's hitting us at COP15? What's the really common thread? What's the complaint of countries in the global south? Lack of finance. Finance. And you can't build the case for finance unless you can value. So that's why this work is so important, right? You need that valuation. You need those case studies. So thanks for that, Ben. Listen, so we're going to turn to Christine Mwangi from WWF Africa. Christine, thanks so much for being here. Christine's come from Nairobi. I was saying it was first time in Montreal. We're predicting snowfall. And Christine and I are planning we're going to co-host a snowball fight a day from now. It's nature-based recreation, not nature-based infrastructure. Christine, WWF has been such a leader on this. There was the Powering with Nature report that came out, I think, this year, which I thought was fantastic in framing the issue around nature-based solutions. Can you give us your perspective on examples where you think this has worked well? Nature-based infrastructure in cities, where has it worked well that you can point us to? Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and I hope we can have a rehearsal for the snowball fight before the actual event. As far as WWF is concerned, and maybe even before I go to the activities that WWF has engaged in, is to acknowledge the imbalanced relationship cities are currently having with water. And I'm looking at water because there are two angles to it. Either it's too much of it, or too little of it. And flooding has been identified as the major nature risk that is facing most cities. The WEF actually, based on a recent study, identified that at least over 70% of 576 largest cities are actually exposed to high risk of pollution, water scarcity, and other natural hazards. And so WWF partnered with Chengda City in China, and one of the main reasons for this MOU or the partnership was to identify, restore, and protect their wetlands. And this was mainly to manage flooding and to also address pollution concerns. Because even where we have plenty of water in cities, then there are concerns that the water may not be clean for consumption. It may be polluted. And then going, just to identify that also, to mention that nature-based infrastructure does not only come with a single benefit. It comes with multiple benefits. Developing countries have a significant challenge in addressing unemployment. So looking at a case in South Africa, working for water, and this was a drought-related activity, to address or to pull out some invasive foreign species of trees that were actually consuming a lot of water and were affecting the urban wetlands and had reduced the supply of water from the urban wetlands by about 4%. And of course, if this was left unchecked, there would have been a significant impact as far as water supply was concerned. And this activity began in 1995. And so the local communities were engaged in uprooting some of these invasive species. And as a consequence, jobs were created. As of the year 2019-2020, at least 60,000 jobs had been created out of this nature-based solution, and water supply had been restored. Out of these 60,000 jobs, we had 70% going to the youth, 55% were women, and 1.5% were people living with disabilities. So that goes to show that the benefits of nature-based infrastructure is not just economic, it's not just environmental, but they can also help address social challenges and improve livelihoods amongst communities.
Christine, thanks so much. I love that you opened with a water example, because again, I'd say to anyone listening in, if you're responsible at a city or municipality, if you're interested in looking at nature-based solutions, nature-based infrastructure, look at it in stormwater management. I mean, the business cases that we've seen with Savvy, even standalone, even without all the co-benefits that Christine's mentioned, the benefits of investing alongside nature, maybe some blended solution, but instead of just pouring concrete, using stormwater retention ponds, using nature, it's remarkable. And then, of course, when you fold in the co-benefits that Christine has mentioned, the social and environmental benefits, it's a really overwhelming case. It's one of the most powerful cases. So thank you, Christine. So Ivo, this is a great segue to go over to you, because water is kind of the low-hanging fruit, if you will, if that's not blending too many analogies or pictures or metaphors. But so there's clearly potential here. But what are the barriers? So why haven't we been able to scale up more of these investments in nature-based infrastructure? What are some of the barriers, and how might we resolve them, including with leveraging more private finance? Over to you, Ivo.
Thanks. So first of all, pleasure to be here. I in the beginning expected maybe 5 or 10 people, but it's great that it's actually quite full now. UNEP last week issued a report just after COP27 and just before COP15, basically putting into perspective how much we're investing in nature and nature-based solutions, which is in the range of 154 billion, and the fact that we need to more than double in the next 3 years, which is a very stiff challenge, especially given the degree of indebtedness, given the degree of high inflation. But if you look at it in the perspective of the global economy, it's literally pocket money that we're throwing at it. And at the same time, the amount of nature negative capital flows, we only calculate the public finance ones, are 3 to 7 times larger. So why is it happening, and what needs to happen? I mean, I come from a very small country, the Netherlands, but like in many other places, almost every square centimeter, every square inch in a city has a economic value. Like if you don't use it for a parking spot, if you don't use it for a shopping mall or for a place to live, it has no value, basically. So the reason I think why nature isn't abundant in many cities around the world is that it's a net cost for people, at least in pure economic and financial terms. But as you saw the report by IISD, if you quantify avoided cost, and one thing I didn't see from the report, but maybe it's included, is health, for example. So like the number of lost nights sleep due to increasing temperatures, the depreciation in quality of life will increasingly manifest itself. And if you quantify that in reduced hospitalizations, in reduced flooding, etc., if a city council and if a mayor wants to incorporate that, and it could, in many countries it would have the legal ability to do it, then you would come to very different kinds of calculations. You also see that real estate prices, both rents as well as the value of real estate for housing, for example, is much higher in areas that have abundant green spaces than in pure gray spaces. So you don't even have to apply a lot of creative accounting to already see from a health perspective, from an economic perspective, and even from a financial perspective. So what does it take to change it? I think it takes economic incentives in terms of subsidies by federal governments, but also by city councils. It requires banks and finance institutions to say, like, what is the low-hanging fruit in terms of extending parks, intensifying the deployment of green roofs in cities, bring back water, but in a measurable way into cities, and sort of see where cash flows can be derived from in terms of water retention, in terms of carbon storage, in terms of increased recreation opportunities. There's different kinds of economic activities that is not a big stretch to quantify. So I think, first of all, it takes imagination. It takes a across-the-board perspective of what all the avoided costs and all the missed financial opportunities are. And then I would say a coalition of the willing between a number of banks, impact investors, city councils, to make that change.
Thanks so much, Ivo. Well, so look, there's the picture emerging in the last 10, 15 minutes here. You saw from Ben and Christine the potential impact of these solutions. And as Ivo said, if I could paraphrase it, you need to value the value, right? If you're going to get the investment, you need to value those investments. So it's actually a great segue over to you, Joanna, because you've done a lot of work on natural capital accounting. So the challenge here is we're not integrating the value of nature on government's balance sheets. And you've been doing some work on that. Can you tell us more about how you see that challenge being addressed in Canadian municipalities, and maybe some of the ways that we're overcoming some of the challenges to properly valuing nature, so we can make the kind of decisions that Ivo has talked about and that lead to the solutions that Ben and Christine have advocated for? Over to you.
Excellent. So I get to tell the good news story, I think, here, so which is what makes me the good guy. So basically in Canada, what has happened over the last couple of years has been a building momentum of local governments that are very conscious of the value and the services that nature provides to citizens, such as air pollution control, temperature control, flood protection, water purification. And they need to manage those services, because otherwise, if they don't have natural assets to do that for them, then they need to compensate or build other infrastructure to do the same job. So we actually have in Canada over 100 local governments now who are working to identify, assess the condition of, and value the services that are being provided by natural assets. And they really want to put them on their financial balance sheets, which is really, I think that it shows a lot of commitment. So people at the moment, in Canada, the accounting rules means that inherited natural assets cannot actually be put on balance sheets. We can put them in note disclosures, but they cannot be part of the assets that we disclose. But the good news, again, is that we are working with the Public Sector Accounting Board, who have kind of opened the discussion. They've removed that exclusion from their overall framework, and they have it in a lower standard that's easier to change. So they are part of the discussion as how we do that. And what we're doing at the moment is developing non-mandatory kind of voluntary guidance that cities and local governments that want to do this work can follow, so that we are following a more standard approach. So I think, the accounting, this work that I'm talking about, we've been partnering with KPMG in Canada and with the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative. I work at the Intech Centre. So we see this work as essential for cities adapting to reduce climate change risk. And I think sometimes what we're all talking about multiple benefits, even sometimes when we are looking at stormwater, we're forgetting that stormwater measures can actually reduce extreme heat risk. So we're often valuing one service, but not all the services are actually being provided, and we're really underselling nature. So I think the work that we're trying to do is to make those values transparent, and the value is not the end game. The end game is asset management planning. So basically, cities and local governments already have asset management plans for their built infrastructure. And what we're asking them to do is, after they're valued, that then we kind of incorporate natural assets into asset management planning that they're already doing. It's not a new process. It's just we're including all the infrastructure rather than just half of it.
Great. Thanks so much, Joanna. So there you have it, right? There's an opportunity here. We need to seize the vision, build a coalition of the willing, as Ivo said, but also make sure we have that proper valuation, whether it's on a project basis with things like work like the IISD is doing, or on the balance sheets, making sure that we're recognizing the tangible asset value there of nature. Let's turn to the audience. What questions, comments, or observations occur to you so far? We're about 25 minutes in. Thoughts, reactions, questions? Please. And maybe if you could introduce yourself first, that'd be great. Can we get this mic turned on? I think, try it now. No? Okay.
I'm Professor Signe Norman. I'm the chair of the Danish Biodiversity Council. It's your, you're sort of here. Maybe. Seems to disappear all the time.
Maybe if you stand up, let's hope that it...
Does it connect better now? Okay, so my question is actually, so it's all great initiatives in relation to sort of using nature-based solutions to get more nature into the city, but how do you see this actually helping biodiversity? Because it's basically exactly the same question as was given before. What is the net gain for biodiversity?
So who'd like to try that one? Christine, I'm looking at you. It might be from WWF's perspective. Here, I'll give you my mic.
Yeah, so thank you. And I will look at it from a systemic perspective. That means that when we get together as all the partners, and this the coalition I think that Ivo alluded to, and also a bit of the value that Joanna was talking about, we are looking at not only the direct service that maybe, I'll use an example. If we want to control flooding, for instance, and we've mismanaged, and the result, what has caused the flooding besides the climate-related effect, is a mismanagement of our wetlands. Then, the first priority for such a city, because different cities will have different priorities depending on what their location is and various other factors. So the priority in this case would then be to restore the wetland. And by restoring the wetland, we are going to be able to, and we will also have clean, and we will also provide or create an opportunity for animals to grow, to breed. You know, for instance, like you've got the ducks, for instance. So you could have, depending on the animals you've got within that ecosystem. And so what you've essentially done by restoring that wetland, you have given an opportunity for various other flora and fauna within that ecosystem to thrive. And that would be the contribution to biodiversity.
Yes, thank you. So I think I agree, but often you structures that support, you tend to create green infrastructure that support common species and not unique species and the species that are actually threatened. So it's just sort of to raising this awareness that we can create nature that can harbor a few species and a few species that are often common anyway. So we need to do more than just making green space. We need to assure that the areas is large enough, that we restore the natural processes, which you're also indicating. But I think it's just really, really important that we're all focusing on what is needed beyond just creating some green space for a few species, but really creating the space for the species that are really threatened.
I think it gets back, Christine, if I just, and I'll hand it back to you. I was just going to say, I think it gets back to the question about planning tools again for cities. Is that what we're saying is that as an asset class, cities should be looking at nature infrastructure alongside their traditional gray infrastructure, because we have enough examples to show where, even on an economic basis, it can be sound. But you're right, when you go a level deeper, there's all kinds of co-benefits. Sometimes it'll be more or less better for climate mitigation or adaptation or for biodiversity. And when you get into the design of those projects, the thing is you need to look at it in that integrated way and look carefully at all of those co-benefits and design for them and lead you to the right spot. Christine, maybe I'll go back to you to see if there's anything else you wanted to add to this.
Yeah, contribution. I absolutely agree with you. And one of the things I would like to emphasize is that the priorities will be different because, again, of the diverse nature of biodiversity. One solution will not necessarily be the solution for another location. So it will be different, and this is now where the identification of what is it that we really want to do, what is the biodiversity that we really want to either reduce loss or to recreate or give room to restore itself or to bring it back in full if it's totally diminished or if it's totally lost. So it would be a very case by case point to look at it. And it's very critical and very important for cities, not just even the planning tools, that all the parties are involved. Here we are talking about the planners, we are talking about the ecologists, we are talking about the investors, we are talking about the politicians. So we are looking at a system where everyone is involved, because then that way, even it helps in identifying what would be the priorities that would benefit everyone. When you're looking at the citizens, we have to get the citizens involved across all ages, across all genders. So that way, we have a more diverse viewpoint that will ensure that our priority is as biodiversity benefit or biodiversity protection is well catered for, and that the local community, who are likely to be the stewards of the biodiversity, can then appreciate and work with you towards the journey to protect and restore the biodiversity.
Thank you, Christine. Yeah, so let's go, Joanna, one more comment, and then we'll go back for another question.
I just wanted to build on what you said, Christine, about systems. I think that's very important. Like here we're talking about cities, but often managing nature, cities is not a boundary that makes sense, right? So when we're managing natural assets or natural systems, then we need to work at the natural scale. So in many cases, if we're talking about water and wetlands, then we're working at the watershed scale. And as we see our cities within that framework. So we're not just talking about creating green space, we're talking about creating function and natural systems that work, that are connected, that reduce fragmentation, that reduce kind of the ecological dysfunction of cities. And I think that I just wanted to make that point that the city boundary is not necessarily what we're working in. We're actually doing the natural asset work at the watershed scale as well now.
Thank you, Joanna. Where do we want to go next? Could I get a hand? Here, please. Yeah.
So
And if you could introduce yourself again, thank you.
Okay, so I'm Julie Clark from the Development Bank of Southern Africa. I work a lot in this field. I take infrastructure projects and I try to link as much as possible nature-based solutions into those infrastructure projects. And then there are limitations to how far you can go, and you can't go all the way. So it's just to be cautious that you don't think you've arrived when you've done that, because it's more your point. You're just on the edge of what is really required. And although everybody says there's lots of money, there is tons of money where there's an internal rate of return. When you're going to make money, there is lots of money. When you're not going to make money, there is no money relative to the need. And that's the big elephant in the room. So yes, where private sector is going to make money, they will couple a lot, or government will couple a lot of ecological infrastructure into built infrastructure, and it's fantastic, absolutely necessary. It raises awareness and opens the way to look at the greater systems and to change the systems, and all of that is absolutely essential. But on the other side, there's this looming disaster of a lack of investment in the greater ecosystem, and governments do not have the money, and private sector can't give the money because there's no internal rate of return, and there's a gap to be closed in that space, and it's a big space, and I really wish a lot more attention would be given to that, because this other space, heaven help you if you're not doing all of that already, even though it's really hard. And it is hard because governments don't manage their assets already. They have an asset and they don't manage it. So then now you're asking them to go beyond that and also manage EI. But you can fight that fight, and it's good to fight that fight, but there is the other fight we mustn't ignore.
That's a great point. Thank you. Because we talk a lot in these rooms about leveraging private finance, but at the end of the day, to do it, you need a revenue stream, right? Something that you're going to securitize or raise debt against. Ivo, I mean, this sounds right in your area. We touched on this a little bit, that, if we value those ecosystem benefits, then we can attach a revenue stream or attach some metric to it. Could you talk a little bit about where you see this going the last 12 or 24 months, and any reaction to that on how we can particularly tackle projects that don't have an obvious revenue stream now, and how we can leverage and scale up the private sector financing in nature-based infrastructure?
Yeah, so I'm a bit improvising because I'm drawing down all kinds of words and ideas on paper. So what I'm about to say might make sense or make no sense at all. First to the question from the lady from Denmark, it's more a question of like what is good enough. Like most of my work has focused so far on sustainable agriculture, sustainable forestry, given that about 3/4 of all the nature impact come from the food system. We've been partnering with Rabobank, with BNP Paribas, with impact investors, and when some of my colleagues see how land is changed because some of the blended finance models, they say, is this all? You move, for example, to monoculture soy in Brazil on degraded land, but it's still soy. It might be, the soil may be less degraded than it was before, the forest may be protected, but you still have a cash flow that is revolving around soy. Is that perfect? No. Is it as good as it can get? Yes, because no one else is willing to do it. Even those kinds of deals are extremely difficult. So I think if we can create a cash flow in cities that are revolving around green roofs, are revolving around extending parks, for example, it won't be perfect the way it was before in terms of all the species that were there, but it's probably much better than what it is right now. One of the things that I was just jotting down here, because you mentioned cash flows, which I think is key. I think through the work that IISD and probably many that you've done and what you've done, Joanna, it will probably not be too difficult to quantify how much money you would save if certain nature-based solutions would be implemented, and you could essentially monetize the climate adaptation and nature benefits in that way. So if a city council would say, okay, the next 4 years, this is how much money it would take to pay for it and make the changes. This is how much avoided costs, and you can quantify it economically, financially, and in terms of human health. They can essentially create a tax around it, like a city tax or something, that is essentially monetizing the increased resilience against, say, heat waves, heat extremes, against bringing back nature. That could be featured in water bills, that could be featured in real estate taxes and otherwise. So it's an indirect way, a proxy almost for how you would monetize that. But then it will probably translate into banks understanding how you could offer different kinds of loans on that. It will probably lead to how property developers would develop new kinds of housing, etc. So I think the starting point is a quantification of all the costs and benefits the way you've done by IISD in some of the cities where you're living, applying some of the tools that you're working yourself. And I think then it's not much a stretch, because the thing is, a city is a defined boundary, and you could basically say within that, say for 50 square kilometers, this is how we're going to apply it.
Thanks, Ivo. Joanne, I'm actually going to ask you, I've got a separate question too, and you can comment on this. And so I'll wait. I think someone's got another question out there, but I'll wait for the audience. But Joanna, I just wanted to pick up on what Ivo said about resilience, is that when you think about nature-based infrastructure, a lot of the focus in cities has been on resilience and adaptation, for good reason, right? I mean, if you're a city manager or a mayor or a city councilor, if I'm one of those people, if you talk to me about stopping flooding, I'm very, very interested, right? I mean, I'm very interested in that. But do you see a danger in that this is focused quite on resilience, or how can we broaden the discussion then around biodiversity and nature positive, not just about climate resilience? Any thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. I have a lot of thoughts. That's basically my life, is looking at nature-based solutions for climate adaptation. So I think just feeding off what Ivo said, I think we're worried about kind of financing, but we're already financing infrastructure. And I think in some cases is what we're actually financing as grey infrastructure the best way of spending the funds that we have. Because when we build grey infrastructure, for example, for climate adaptation, often we're taking a protection approach. So we're assuming that we are going to hold the line of coastal erosion, or we are going to defend against worsening flooding. And we have to maintain those forever if we're going to keep that position. So that when you talk about the cost of grey infrastructure, you need to think about the whole life cycle over 100 years, is like what we look at in the UK, for example. And then when you compare the cost of a nature-based solution that's more working with natural processes, maybe giving up some land and retreating from really high-risk areas, then the costs might be actually much lower. So it's often a question of also the cost-benefit of what funding we already have available and are looking at spending on grey infrastructure. And grey infrastructure is very much a default solution for adaptation at the moment, often. And nature-based solutions is still seen as fairly innovative in many countries. Others in the UK and the Netherlands are a little bit further ahead, maybe. But, so we are just kind of, we don't want to paint ourselves into a corner with grey infrastructure when we could do so much more with nature-based solutions. And we are underselling nature. When we're looking at prioritizing projects or kind of cost-benefit analyses, often the biodiversity benefits or the other benefits are not included in the economic calculations. So, of course, the grey infrastructure seems favorable because of avoided costs, but when you layer all the avoided costs and the additional benefits, then nature-based solutions wins out. So I think it's very important to include all the benefits, and we have been very bad at doing that kind of up till now, and I see it changing, which is the positive note I will end on.
Thanks, Joanna. Back to the audience. Any questions or comments, observations on the discussion thus far? Another one, yeah, please. No, I feel like we should put you up on the panel. Maybe you should take my seat.
I'm so
Thank
sorry,
you.
but I found that the big thing to do was, if you look at the way environmentalists work in terms of EIAs, they are so apologetic, and they say, yes, you can have this project, but please, we can mitigate this as much as possible, and that we can let go, and that we can let go, and we'll just mitigate here, and it'll cost you a whole $100. We're so sorry. Then you look at how the engineers come in, and they say it's $1 billion to do this properly, and if you don't do it properly, it's going to fail. And then they, down to the T, tell you how much a piece of piping costs. They know their business, and they present their business, and they argue their business. And then you look at the way the environmentalists come, and it's cap in hand. Would you mind just giving £100 for this? And that's the difference. Environmentalists need to come to the party at the same level, with the same force, and with the same level of argument and the same detail of why ecological infrastructure is so important and has to happen, and how much it costs to the finest detail in terms of capital outlay and in terms of maintenance thereafter. And they have to present it with, if the engineer's report is 100 pages, the environmental report must be 100 pages. And when we equal that, then we'll start getting this thing happening.
I think that's so well said, and it gets back to why we've established this Global Resource Center, right? We want to bring that same rigor, that same financial analysis, and former bankers who can come in and say, here are the benefits, here also are the hard costs, much like that bridge will collapse if you don't engineer it properly. Here's what will happen for future flooding or biodiversity loss, and paint that. I think you're absolutely right. Joanna, yeah.
I just want to add to that because so we often talk about engineers like they're kind of they control everything, but the engineers are getting smarter on this, and they are collaborating. I mean, I'm not an engineer, I'm a geomorphologist, so I often get told I'm an engineer, but I'm not. The design guidance for nature-based solutions is hotting up. Like, we have international design guidance for river and coastal mitigation projects now. We have in Canada, we are developing design guides for coastal risk management projects using nature-based solutions, and we have another project for river risk avoidance as well. So I think the standards are definitely catching up, and the engineers are on board. United States Army Corps in particular has engineering with nature. I don't know if anyone's listened to that podcast, but they are all over this. So it's not a them and us situation, it's us all together.
Thanks so much. So I'll look for other hands from the audience, but meanwhile, I'm going to go back to Christine. Did I see another hand? Oh, yeah, please.
Yeah, Matthew Reddy with the GEF. You asked the question before. I didn't catch your name. I just walked in and just caught the question. Pardon me. The question you asked was around, is there a risk in just looking at infrastructure from a resilience point of view? And my sense is, yes, we're looking at things from a risk, a cost-benefit analysis. But what about when we really look at the value of nature in infrastructure planning? And are we just looking at things from too much of a risk perspective, an engineering cost-benefit analysis? Or what could this infrastructure really do to support biodiversity? Not just a risk, but how can we develop infrastructure that has a really positive effect on biodiversity, irrespective of its cost-benefit analysis and, virtues versus grey infrastructure? There's wonderful port developments that we're seeing in certain locations where they're supporting marine biodiversity and in some cases aquatic biodiversity, flyways, migratory paths. What about some examples where we're seeing a really positive effect from infrastructure on biodiversity and not just a consideration of risk and cost?
Yeah, fully agree. And that's where this integrated analysis comes in. So I don't know if Ben or Joanna, if you want to jump in on this. But you're right, it isn't just about an impact analysis, right? It's actually how do you estimate that nature positive impact of a project? And to Joanna's work on natural capital accounting, how do you value it so that you can ultimately attract the private sector investment and other investment to it? Joanna or Ben, I don't know. Ben, maybe
Thanks. Yeah. No, I think it's a great point. I mean, I think that's definitely something we try to do. And for some projects, it's absolutely clear, right? That nature positive, and we value that and we include that. But one of the challenges is that that tends to be the low-hanging fruit in terms of where it's so clear, that nature positive is so clear that those tend to be funded also by philanthropic organizations or private sector organizations that may be interested in offsetting their activities. What we're finding the really challenging piece is the piece that you've mentioned, which is really when we're comparing it to actual gray infrastructure in terms of the services that it provides, that becomes extremely, extremely challenging. But one of the good outcomes or some positive outcome from many of our studies that we've seen is that when it's combined with kind of built infrastructure, gray infrastructure, we are seeing a real commitment to making those investments in nature-based infrastructure, because that combined value, and that goes to questions around resilience and also questions around just efficacy. How well does that infrastructure work? And we're finding with a lot of our analysis is that it works much better with a nature-based component. That doesn't necessarily solve the really tricky question, which I think you posed, which is around cash flows. And this is also an issue that I think we're often challenged with. And maybe this is a question, if I may, back to Ivo, which is, when one goes to these conferences, and one of the challenges, particularly from the financial industry, one of the comments that we constantly hear is that there are not enough bankable projects, right? We'd like to see more bankable projects. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And part of what we try to do is help project proponents, particularly those that aren't maybe as sophisticated as a World Bank, to create those bankable projects. But part of the challenge, frankly, is that it's a bit of, if you will, this is going to sound very, in some ways it's a bit of an excuse by the financial industry to say there aren't enough bankable projects, because one really has to unpack what they're saying there. It depends on what type of return are they demanding, right? And it also depends on what level of discount rate they decide to assume. And these are value decisions ultimately. And these are not things that are written in stone, right? These are things that can be changed over time. And one of the things ultimately that we would like to see is changing the definition of what is a bankable project, right? What does it mean to be a bankable project? And so when you hear someone from the finance industry say there's not enough bankable projects, say, well, what do you mean? What are you possibly talking about? What is bankable for you? Particularly a financial industry, which we have many of them here, who have committed to nature positive actions. What does a bankable project mean when you're committed to nature positive actions? And so I think it's something as a community we need to challenge the financial industry when they say there's just not enough projects to fund. Based on whose values?
Thanks so much, Ben. I want to go. Ivo, did you want to respond to that?
I could.
I'll tell you what. I'm going to raise my question for Christine. Then why don't you go? And then Christine, I'll give Christine a moment to think about this. Because Christine, I want to just come back, and it's actually stepping back a little bit. Because I wanted to ask you, listening to all of this, what else do you think governments, either civic or national governments, regional governments, can do in all of this to better promote this integrated approach to actually incorporate the value of nature and investments, the role of government? And if you can, of course, WWF is global, but you're joining us here from Kenya, and I just wondered if it's an invitation, if you have a lens here from the global south, how, because this has been, we're kind of talking investors. I feel like this conversation is kind of a global north dominated kind of conversation. But do you have a view that something else you might put on the table from the perspective of the global south, where this is a very hot topic, including today, about valuing nature? So Ivo, maybe over to you, and then we'll give Christina a shot.
Yeah, I like to put other people on the spot, so it's good that Ben puts me on the spot. So sort of touche. I think first to Matthew's point. Both Matthew, Ben, and myself lived in Geneva. Matthew and Ben fled the city. I'm still there, hanging on. But it has a beautiful river called the Rhône River, flowing out of the Lake Geneva into France, and all along the river it's dense forest, and if you're on the river you don't feel like you're in a city actually. So to the question of don't only see it as a cost, don't only see it as a risk mitigation. I think if that forest were to be gone, if they would canalize the Rhône River in that area, I'm pretty sure that a lot of residents in Geneva would decide to leave, because it attaches so much quality of life beyond the actual income that you have. And I think if you bring that more into other cities, and there's so many cities that are either even along coasts or along major rivers, it will really increase the quality of life and retain talent, etc. So I think this is also how city councils could see it from an opportunity perspective. To your point, Ben, what is a bankable project, and what is a kind of an investment return that is decent, and it's never good enough. I don't think any of us here in this room is ever going to change that, because a financial institution would say, I'll decide with your savings or your credit account how I will deploy that. I will try to maximize the profit for my bank, and I'll provide you an interest rate that is linked to LIBOR, for example. What I think is possible, and maybe Joanna, you have any examples from Canada, or Christine from Nairobi, is that I think like with renewable energy, where more and more banks are developing loan products linked to the installation of solar PV, so solar panels, or energy retrofitting, where they simply say, okay, if an X amount of cost is invested in retrofitting and making a building more energy efficient, this is how much lower the energy bills will be for the resident in that building, and this is how it can pay me back. The same for the solar PV system. If we install it, this is how much it will cost in the beginning, this is what the reduction would be, and you can basically develop a loan product around it. The same is true for NBS. If you're greening roofs, if you're increasing the amount of green spaces, you can quantify whether you can charge a higher rent. You can look at whether you reduce the heat island effect. There's all kinds of additional benefits that you can essentially quantify and develop a loan product around. It would likely have to be further incentivized by city councils in terms of like a carbon payment or a nature credit or something, or what I mentioned about a tax reduction or a tax addition that a financial institution can do. But I think starting one-on-one for those kinds of measures where you can actually quantify the cash flows, especially if a city council or a local government is willing to use fiscal incentives in addition to that. I think there you can develop products, and then it's really for a bank simply to roll it out to its customers. They might have, 20 different property developers, and they say, we're going to develop this loan product, and we roll it out to the 20 or 50 different property developers. For Rabobank, we work with them in Brazil. They have developed a number of loans for farmers for long-term lending. Now they try to develop a standardized loan product and roll it out to all 1,000 farmers. So this question of bankable project is indeed a bit of a misnomer. I think once there is a product, they can simply decide to roll it out to an X number of existing or new clients.
Yeah. So thank you. In terms of the role that the governments can play, and I'll focus more on the global south. And so one is the aspect of spatial planning. Recognizing spatial planning and recognizing key biodiversity areas when we are developing or setting up development in our urban centers. Why? There are three layers when we look at urban development. There are three layers that support urban development. So we have the nature layer, and we have the built infrastructure layer that sits on the nature layer, and we have the social layer that connects the built infrastructure and the natural and the nature layer. And the three layers are important, but there's got to be a healthy balance between the three layers. And what we are experiencing right now is an imbalance. So where the nature layer is kind of overwhelmed by the built environment, and as a consequence, the social layer is also suffering. But if we have spatial planning that is integrated in our urban development plans, then we may be able to effectively manage, identify the natural layer, the strengths of the natural layer that we can utilize either to strengthen or to replace some of the built infrastructure, and as a consequence also enhance value to the social layer. So that's one. Secondly, I'll go back to the systems approach towards urban governance. And here we are looking at a situation whereby the process is driven from a national government level, coordinated at the city level, and anchored on policies that promote or favor nature-based infrastructure over gray infrastructure. We could have the national government set the path on developing or in developing guidelines and regulations that are pro-nature positive infrastructure. But of course, there could be a capacity gap in doing this. And secondly, the other thing that the national governments could do, and this is in relation to what Joanne alluded to earlier, is the national capital accounting. The proposition is to have natural capital accounting happen at the national level, so that we are able to consider the benefits of nature from the integrated, from an overall approach as opposed to a fragmented, or from an integrated approach as opposed to a fragmented approach. And I'll use an example in Kenya whereby the city of Nairobi, that is fed by a water tower, and what was by water from a different water tower that's not located within the city, is experiencing water shortages. And the issue is because there are land use activities, land use change activities that are happening around the water tower. And when you have a national approach towards the focus on nature-based infrastructure, then you're looking at what is happening in that other water tower, or what is happening in that other area that is likely to affect other areas within the country and not just within the city. Coordination at the city level is very critical, because this is where you bring all the parties together. And it's what she was talking about. The engineers are coming with their report. We have the ecologists coming with their report. We have the investors coming with their report. We have the city planners coming with their report. And most importantly, we also have the community coming with their report, because there is no better person to understand the situation on the ground than the community. And to also agree with them what are the benefits and what are the costs that would accrue either way, depending on the type of infrastructure we decide to adopt, or either from a purely nature-based infrastructure or a hybrid. What would be the impact for each of that would affect each of the communities, and what would be the benefits? In terms of policy, innovative policy. And when we are talking about innovation, it's not necessarily anything new. It could be looking at what are the existing policies, how can we modify them? And there is what Ivo mentioned on the incentives. What are the current incentives? Because there is a possibility that the incentives that are there currently are favoring gray infrastructure. So is there a way we can modify these incentives and introduce incentives that would then favor the development of nature-based infrastructure?
Thank you so much, Christine. I particularly liked your point about the 3 layers, that integrated approach. Look, we're out of time. Look, let me just summarize very quickly to say that, the good news here is we've heard that nature-based infrastructure has tremendous potential, not just to solve infrastructure problems in a way that is nature positive and positive for people, but in a way that can be even economically attractive. The challenge, of course, is we're not moving at the speed and scale needed. That's going to require the valuation that we're working on. That's going to require the knowledge. That's going to require new pools of capital. That's going to require the integrated approach, whether it's balancing the 3 layers, as Christine talked about so well, between built infrastructure, nature, and social, or evaluating all the co-benefits as we do in Savvy. It's also going to require moving at speed and scale to tie to why we're all here today. Moving at speed and scale is going to require the right signals and targets from a post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and that's what we're all here in Montreal about. So that kind of agreement will tie to the kind of incentives, the kind of goals that we need, that we can then come up and build the markets and deliver nature-based infrastructure that can align with it. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists, Ben for the report, Joanna, Christine, Ivo. Thank you all for being here, sharing your thoughts, and for the great discussion. Thank you, and have a great day. And my last 20 seconds is a commercial just to say that the next door tomorrow, all afternoon, is a nature and climate thematic afternoon from 1 to 7. Actually, and a big chunk of it is going to be a focus on nature-based infrastructure. And so I actually have some, I think they're just, you don't actually need tickets, but I've got some promotional tickets for it too if you want to hear more about it. Thank you all.
May I ask, have you ever heard about this issue of living concrete or not? Has anybody heard about this issue of living concrete? Have you? No. Like I saw something just after COP where
I saw this a couple weeks ago, but I don't recall the details.
Okay. They're basically mixing bacteria in concrete, and that whenever there's cracks, basically the bacteria excrete a carbonate that meant the cracks. Therefore, you don't have to tear down, say, an apartment complex or anything. So it's a nature-based solution embedded in grey infrastructure.